Hello, my name is Tammy Heiss, and I'm here with Kate Hartmann, who is this year's junior nominee to the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend competition. Each year, the Wyoming Humanities Research Institute, on behalf of the University of Wyoming, nominates candidates for this NEH competition. Winning one of these grants allows a researcher dedicated time during the summer to focus on their projects. I'm so excited to be here with Kate today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Tammy.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Kate, can you tell us a little bit about your project?
Yes, so the project that I'm proposing to do this summer addresses the broad question of how a famous cultural narrative becomes meaningful in the lives of individuals. So we know that across cultures, there are these important stories through which cultures, talk about heroes, talk about the good life, talk about dangers that all of us face. And we as scholars have largely focused on what those stories mean in their own sense and haven't yet started to focus in on the question of what do those mean for individuals and how do they become meaningful for individuals? And so that's the really broad question here. And the specific story I'm looking at is the story of the Tibetan hero Milarepa. And I'm looking at a Tibetan diary written from 1944 to 1956, written by a guy named Khatak Zamyak. And while he's on pilgrimage during those years, he references the Milarepa story over 60 times. And so I'm interested in writing a book chapter analyzing how Khatak Zamyak, the diary author, interacts with the Milarepa story and makes it meaningful for him in the context of his own life.
Great. I imagine, though, that a lot of our audience is not familiar with Tibetan religious culture. Can you tell us a little bit more about Milarepa?
Yeah, so Milarepa is said to be the most famous figure in Tibetan religious history. He lived about the 11th century, and scholars aren't sure if he's a historical figure or not. For the most part, he's talked about as this kind of legendary figure. And Milarepa, the story goes, was born to a decently well-off family, not overly rich, but also not overly poor. However, one day his father dies, and in the scramble to take over the family estate, his evil aunt and uncle take over everything, leaving Milarepa, his siblings, and his mother destitute and poor. This drives his mother, pretty understandably, a little bit mad, and she makes the demand that Milarepa has to get vengeance for the sake of the family, for the sake of their father, against the aunt and uncle who have taken everything from them. And so what she says to young Milarepa is, you have to go off and study sorcery. You have to study black magic so that you can get revenge on this evil aunt and uncle. And so Milarepa doesn't feel great about this, but then again, when your mother asks you to do something, you do it. So he goes off, studies magic, comes back, and as the aunt and uncle are celebrating, along with various people in the village, he brings down a terrible hailstorm on this party, killing lots of people. And as he's looking over the scene of death and destruction, and also at his mother, who has been driven mad by this longing for revenge, he says, this isn't the way to live. I've done this horrible thing. How can I fix this? And so he runs off to decide to try to end suffering in this world, end the cycle of someone doing something to someone else and then someone getting revenge and so on and so forth. So he goes to study with another famous Tibetan hero named Marpa. And after many trials and tribulations, he eventually becomes this wonderful living saint. And his story and the songs that he sings become really famous for Tibetan culture. And this story was probably the most recited story in Tibetan culture.
Well, that's really fascinating. How did you become interested in this particular project?
So my purview here is the religions of Asia. More broadly, I teach in history, philosophy, and religious studies, but my specialization is on the history of pilgrimage in Tibet. And so as I was doing that research for my book project, which is already out for peer review, fingers crossed, I encountered lots of sources that I wasn't able to include in the book itself, which focused on pilgrimage and the goal of seeing holy mountains. But I encountered lots of stuff that I said, this is a really great source for some future project. And so one of the chapters of my book is about this pilgrim diary. And it's by this gentleman named Katak Zamyak. No worries about pronunciation here, Katak Zamyak. And he was born in 1896, lived to 1961. And he has this interesting life where he's born to this merchant family. He goes through some trials and tribulations of his own. And in order to sort of get out of this place where these trials and tribulations have happened, he sets out on a 12-year pilgrimage to central Tibet and the various holy sites. And so from 1944 to 1956, he keeps a diary of everything that he's doing. And the complete diary is 268 pages. And so it's this wonderful resource for what he's doing every day, what he's thinking, where he's going, his activities. And, in the book, I focus on a particular section when he's out a particularly famous holy mountain. But the diary is this really rich resource for Tibetan cultural life. This is especially the case because we don't have that many diaries. Tibetans seem to have kept diaries. This was a broad practice, but just like you or me would never want our diaries published, so too did Tibetans. They would keep them for their own sake, but then, hide them away or destroy them. And so very few diaries are available for scholars. And his is, in fact, the only one that I know of that is pre-1959 and not written by an elite religious figure. So again, it's this very unique lens into Tibetan religious culture from the perspective of this one individual.
When you're talking about a pilgrim diary, does that mean something specific in this context that maybe we should explore a little bit more?
Yeah, so in Tibetan, the word for diary here is nyendep, which literally means nyen de dep book. So it's literally a day book. So our English word of diary, which has this sense of daily in it, is a quite apt translation. And these would have been kept by, any sort of person that may have been going on pilgrimage, may not have been going on pilgrimage. But for him, he very much starts keeping the diary when he sets off on pilgrimage and ends it when he's done with the pilgrimage. So for him, it's particularly associated with these travels. And he says at the beginning of the diary, I'm keeping this diary so that I can remember the places I go and the people I see on pilgrimage. So it's not necessarily the case that all pilgrims would have kept a diary or that diaries were only for pilgrims, but he takes this general genre of diary and leans particularly into it while he's on pilgrimage.
So what are some of the ways that Katak Sumak engages with Milarepa's life story?
Yeah, so Katak Zamyak, and yes, I know the Tibetan pronunciation is not for everyone. No worries here. Often when I'm teaching students, I say you can call him KZ if you want, or just K. Mr. K is fine. So Katak Zamyak, as he's on pilgrimage, one of the things that he does is he takes notes of what he's reading. And this is really interesting because for a long time, scholars of Tibetan have not really known what literacy rates are. So are people reading stories? Are they hearing stories? Are things passed down by folklore? But Katak Zamyak, for his sake, is very literate, and he buys books and he reads them, often around the campfire at the end of the day. So he reads aloud with his travel companions. And he mentions doing that at several points throughout the diary. So he has a copy of Milarepa's story and he's reading it out loud. He also, at certain points, will copy passages from the diary or copy passages from the Milarepa story into his diary. Often when he notices what to him seems like a striking similarity between some episode in his own life and some episode in Milarepa's life, he'll describe the story as it happens to him. And he's like, it's just like when this happened to Milarepa, and Milarepa sang the following song. He's also going to places associated with Milarepa. So Tibetan pilgrimage is this wonderfully fascinating topic. And there's all sorts of different holy sites that are holy for different reasons. One set of holy sites is holy by virtue of their associations with past masters. And we have this in the US, right? If you go to a hotel on the East Coast and it says, oh, George Washington slept here, that'll have historical associations. Similarly, places where Milarepa went and traveled and did important things, Tibetans will commemorate those places. So he's specifically going to places associated with Milarepa, and he'll write down in the diary what happened in that place and that he goes to see it and he thinks about the story. And then lastly, he'll just quote Milarepa when, again, something happens, and he'll be reminded of Milarepa and these circumstances.
Great.
So he's engaging with it in these multiple sorts of ways.
So if we go back to when I butchered the Tibetan pronunciation of his name, you mentioned that, you talk to your students about this in a particular way. So I just wondered if you'd say a little bit about how your research relates to your teaching.
Yeah, and I think this is a really valuable question for us here at the Wyoming Institute of Humanities Research. All of us scholars have these dual identities where half the time we're engaging in these research projects in our subfields. We're trying to push out the boundaries of knowledge and raise new questions and think about these things. But then the other half of our lives, we're teaching students who, they don't know necessarily a whole lot about the specifics of Tibetan pilgrimage history. I teach about the religions of Asia broadly. And so there's this very fair question that arises is how do we connect our hyper-specific research projects with the kind of broad teaching that we're doing, often to students who are not majors. We're trying to train them to go out in whatever career that they do, more culturally sensitive, more able to appreciate difference, more able to talk about difficult things like religion in civil and respectful ways. So one of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about this project is what I call a first-person approach to religion. So often when we're studying places that are far away geographically or far away in terms of time, it's easy to assume that people just enact cultural systems without a second thought. So students will say to me when we're learning about Buddhism, they'll say, oh, all Buddhists must be vegetarians, right? And they'll just assume that the kind of religious ideals of a tradition are expressed by every person in that tradition. And, that makes sense as a first pass. But if we take a step back, we'll notice that in the communities around us, people are incredibly complicated, internal diversity, people doing things that you wouldn't expect or that are technically not allowed. Humans are kind of rowdy, and they're always interpreting shared religious stories in ways that are personal to their own experience. There's always a dialogue between broader cultural meanings and the way people relate stuff to their particular human circumstances. And so one of the things that I try to convey, even in a broad class like Intro to World Religions, Religions of Asia, Intro to Buddhism, is that people are human first and they're religious second. They're never just mindlessly applying the things that their tradition tells them to do. No, as humans, they are complicated and selective and doing interesting things that you may not expect. And all of those individual meanings are made by individual people who are as different, as complex as you and I. And so in this research project, I'm interested in how Khatak Zamyak reads this Milarepa story, often in ways that are quite not traditional. He takes it in weird ways sometimes, just like all of us interpret movies and books and TV shows in ways that are specific to our own circumstances. And so I take that broad lesson and try to help students understand that all of us, including people from very distant times and places, are navigating the world using cultural resources, but also shaping them to our own individual preferences, experiences, interests, and so forth. So that's at least how I think about how those things are connected for me.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have a sense now of what your answer to the next question might be, but I wonder if you could speak to why you think this project is important.
Yeah. So again, religious stories are hugely important. You can think about, the Odyssey and the Iliad. For my students, Lord of the Rings or Star Wars will be important cultural touchstones. And often these stories, these narratives are much more important for our daily sense of ourselves in the world than abstract religious doctrines. Often, my students will be, a practicing active part of a religious tradition, and that's great. And, they're not thinking about the abstract philosophy. They're relating to stories. And that makes sense because we humans are storytelling creatures. What's sort of sad about the field of religious studies is that we've taken a while to catch up to that. And at least historically, the field has focused on doctrine and philosophy and all of these very high-minded things. But as the field has progressed, we've started to become more interested in narratives. But then again, what do those narratives mean to individuals? And so I'm helping to focus in on both stories in general as shaping how we live and experience the world, but then also how general stories are made relevant to the lives of individuals. So I think that's a really kind of cool thing about religion that helps us both understand, this Tibetan pilgrim who's reading this story that maybe is not so familiar to us. But when we reflect, all of us can think about how stories have shaped our own lives. And that this research helps us both learn something new about the world and then reflect back on our own formation.
Kate, what is the outcome for this project?
Yeah, so this summer, the 2 months very generously funded by the NEH will be focused on writing a book chapter for an edited volume on narrative and ethics in South Asia. And so that is due at the end of August. So I'll spend the summer writing and editing this book chapter. But ultimately, a long-term goal of mine is to publish a full translation of the diary. So this diary by Khatak Samyak, it's written in classical Tibetan, although there's a lot of Khampa dialect mixed in. And by virtue of the fact that I've worked with this diary in a couple different scholarly writings, I have a working translation of the whole thing. But I'd like to polish that up and publish the full diary as a translation for future scholars. Because most people can't read classical Tibetan. I have the fun distinction of being able to do that. And so I'd like to take this whole diary and make it available for a broader audience.
That's a fascinating project. Now, we don't have very much more time, so I want to close with a fun question for the benefit of our viewers. What are you reading now, and what books would you recommend to us?
Yes. So the first thing I'll recommend is The Life of Milarepa, which is a Penguin classic of world literature. It is available, and it's a really fun read. And, hopefully this story, as I related it to you, of somebody who is, born into a circumstance, dealt this horrible hand by fate, but then also does stuff that he feels guilty about and goes on this journey of redemption. I think that that's a really universally relatable story, and it's a wonderful resource from Tibetan to the world. It's available in translation by Andrew Quintman, and it's a really fun read, I think, for anyone. And the translation by Andy Quintman has an introductory section that will make it more accessible if you're nervous about reading something, from Tibetan. Another book that I've been reading for a different class that I'm teaching is Buddhist Ethics by Jay Garfield. So, as I said, we always have these dual identities as both researchers and teachers. And one of the classes I'm teaching this semester is Buddhist Ethics. So how do Buddhists think about the good life? What are the kind of dangers? What are the reasons that we engage in negative actions? And how can we overcome those to live a good life? Jay Garfield provides a really wonderful introduction of how Buddhists have thought about that historically. And he's addressed an audience that is not otherwise versed in Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist knowledge. So I think it's a wonderful introduction, and it's the main textbook that I'm using to teach this class. So students have been really enjoying it. So I think it's not just me that would say that it's great. And then Rethinking Meditation by David McMahon just came out this summer. And it's this really wonderful history of how it is that meditation went from being this thing practiced by a very small minority of Buddhists to becoming the kind of modern mindfulness industry that we see all around us. What has changed in that process? What are the key points of historical shift? And what are some questions that scholars are asking about meditation, its history, its potential, its role in society? And again, I think that that's one of the best scholarly works is one that contains really up-to-date research, but expresses it in a clear way for a general audience. So those are three things that I'm reading right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kate, for speaking with me, and I'm thrilled to see how your project progresses. And thank everyone for watching. If you're interested in seeing some of the Institute's other lectures and interviews, please check out our YouTube channel and podcast. Feel free to get more information about our organization or join our mailing list at www.uwyo.edu/humanities. We always appreciate it when you like, comment, or subscribe. Goodbye.
Thanks so much, Tammy.
Thank you.